Hello, and welcome back to the Virtual Classroom, U.S. History Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, Neoliberalism and the 1990s. Now, as always, take a quick moment, hit pause on your video screen, jot down the outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms on the left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to connect them to each other and to their larger historical context. Now, with that, let's get started. Now, when we left off last time, we were discussing politics during the 1980s, specifically the Reagan Revolution, and just how much that changed politics in America. And this lecture is very much a continuation of that, as will basically the next lecture. And so ultimately the question that kind of guides us is what really was the impact of the Reagan Revolution on American politics? Now, again, we discussed those legacies at the end of the last lecture, but it's important to see them actually play out now in real time. And so in 1988, Reagan is out. He served his 2 terms. He's done. And we're going to have a new president. And it was a very easy choice for Republicans. They're going to side with his vice president, George H.W. Bush, Papa Bush. And again, he's easy because America's economy was going well. We had, the Cold War was drawing to a close, it seemed. And so it seemed like a logical choice to pick, the VP to carry on that idea of his legacy. Meanwhile, the Democrats are kind of, a hot mess. They're wandering around in the wilderness trying to find their identity, trying to find themselves. Eventually, they settle on Michael Dukakis, who was seen as a cookie-cutter liberal for most issues. He was perceived as lacking passion. He was stoic. He was weak on defense. He actually threatened to cut back Reagan's spending on defense. And to combat this, he's something really stupid. He posed, as you see the picture there, of himself in a tank to try to show that, hey, see, I'm tough on Cold War and on military stuff too. Yeah, it was a disaster. It was a disastrous photo op. And on the other hand, George H.W. Bush seemed like the logical choice to be an extension, of course, of, Ronald Reagan. Now, Bush was not Reagan. Bush was a very different kind of Republican. In fact, some of the press dubbed him a country club Republican. In fact, during the 1980 campaign, he had criticized Reagan's idea of supply-side economics. He actually called it voodoo economics. But suddenly in 1988, because he wants to be president, suddenly he's in favor of Reaganomics. And, of course, he makes a very defiant statement that will come back to haunt him, saying, quote, "Read my lips. No new taxes," unquote. And these words will come back to haunt him because, quite honestly, Papa Bush, George H.W. Bush, kind of inherits a mess. Again, he wins the election easily over Dukakis. Again, America was happy with this new turn to conservatism, it seemed, for the most part, and the economy was good. Reagan Republicans get the credit for that. And so H.W. is able to easily win the election. But like I said, he does inherit a number of things. Some are good, some are bad. Well, he does inherit a good economy, so let's keep that going, hopefully. He also inherits a rapidly de-escalating Cold War. Now, we talked about this before, right? There's a number of these independence movements in those Eastern Bloc nations. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria. All of them seemed to be getting their independence, and Mikhail Gorbachev did nothing to stand in their way. And of course, the big thing that happened, 1989, the year that H.W. takes over, the Berlin Wall comes tumbling down. Literally, piece by piece, as citizens began to dismantle the wall by hand, thus reuniting East and West Berlin, and by the following year, East and West Germany. Now, for his part, Gorbachev does not get much credit for this. I mean, he does help end the Cold War in this respect, but the Soviet Union was a mess, and very unceremoniously, on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1991, the Soviet Union, at the Kremlin in Moscow, will very unceremoniously lower the Soviet flag and instead raise a Russian flag, signifying the Soviet Union is dead, is only Russia now. And for his efforts, Gorbachev is basically kicked out of office. He's very unpopular in the former Soviet Union, especially in Russia. And he'll be replaced by the man you see there, Boris Yeltsin. Now, Yeltsin wanted to institute what he called shock therapy. Basically, it was an attempt to bring parts of capitalism and democracy to Russia. In the end, it's a massive failure, as the money fell into the hands of a few wealthy oligarch families. Corruption will spread rapidly, and by 2000, Yeltsin is replaced by Vladimir Putin, which we all know, well, though theoretically he's elected, he's far from a democratic president. Now, back to Bush. He also inherited a second international issue, and this was trouble in the Middle East. And here's the background. Back during the Reagan administration, the U.S. had backed a dictator in Iraq known as Saddam Hussein. And the reason we did so is they were in a conflict against Iran, and we, of course, wanted to make sure we were able to maintain good oil from Iraq. And so, and plus remember, we don't like Iran thanks to the Iranian hostage crisis. And so this U.S. under Reagan and Bush, they will support Saddam Hussein in this war against Iran, the Iran-Iraqi war. Well, flash forward to the end of the decade, and Iraq is in some massive war debt. Now, to help pay off this massive debt, they want more oil revenue from their neighbor to the south, Kuwait, who politely refuses. They're a sovereign nation. They want no part of helping Saddam Hussein. And so Saddam decides to military assert itself and take over Kuwait to get to their oil. Now, George H.W. Bush, he wants to repent. He wants a do-over here. And he urges the UN to oppose Saddam Hussein. And so the U.S. will lead a United Nations force to liberate Kuwait. This is known as Operation originally Desert Shield, and later, very quickly, Operation Desert Storm. Again, this is a very quick war. And essentially, it's led by, as you see on the screen, by General Norman Schwarzkopf. And the whole strategy was to overwhelm the enemy. And the reason this is a very quick war is because, remember, Reagan spent most of the 80s beefing up our military to the Cold War. Now that the Cold War is over, we have all this massive military and armaments. It had nothing to do with them. So we throw them all at Saddam Hussein. We began to bomb Iraq minute by the minute. They were, by the way, fun fact, they were known as Patriot missiles. And the missiles that the Iraqis used were called Scud missiles. Just think of the propaganda here. The Patriot against the Scud. Which one just sounds like they should be the hero here? Seriously, guys, this started officially in January 17th, 1991. So January 17th, 1991. Within 3 weeks, we were knocking on the capital of Iraq, Baghdad's door. We could see it. They were within sight. And all of a sudden, Bush stops. We pushed Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. We've pushed them back as far as their capital, Baghdad. And then we just stopped. Bush was unwilling to advance and take out the capital and thus take out Saddam Hussein. Why? Again, there were a lot of critics of this. But Papa Bush, again, I'm going to give him credit where credit's due here. What his reasoning is, okay, great. If we take out Saddam Hussein, yes, he's an evil, vile dictator. He's a tyrant. But we know what type of tyrant he is. If you remove him from the region, you create a power vacuum. Who or what may replace him? It may be far worse. And because you don't know that, let's stick with the evil we know rather than the evil we don't know. Now, of course, unfortunately, we do know what's going to replace him in the future. We'll come to that in our next lecture. Now, domestically, you see, Bush was promising an extension of the Reagan years. And he immediately has to deal with something else he inherited, which was a bad economy. Because even though the Reagan years were known by prosperity, we were having some faltering problems, and that specifically was in the realm of our national debt. And I mentioned this last time. Reagan racked up a massive national debt. And the issue here was, how do you continue his domestic policies without raising taxes, but yet maintain this national debt? And the answer is you can't. Instead, what he does, he tries to follow through with Reagan's Reaganomics by passing a massive tax cut, which of course only went to the wealthiest of Americans, and the idea of trickle-down economics, the hope it would stimulate greater giving to the government. And of course, it fails. Instead, in doing so, he racks up a $2.6 trillion debt. Now, this is not all Bush's fault. It started because of Reagan. But because Bush does not know really what to do other than cut taxes, there's no way to pay for this debt or balance this budget. And so by 1990, our country is in a fiscal mess. And ultimately, he's forced to accept a budget that increases taxes, even though he had said, read my lips, no new taxes. Well, by 1990, he's forced to do so, which makes him incredibly unpopular, incredibly unlikable by the majority of our country. He, as a way to get out of this, he actually tried to claim that the Democrats forced me to set this budget. I had no choice. Well, you do see how that looks, right? So you're telling me that the president was forced to accept this budget by the other party. That just conveys weakness and inability to lead. And so even though Bush was praised for his efforts in the Gulf War, in the Desert Storm War, in the Gulf War, he is seen as a weak leader by much of the country due to his handling of the economy. And of course, it's the economy, stupid. I keep repeating this line over and over again. It's the economy. And so by 1992, it's a new election year. And finally, in 1992, the Democrats are trying to figure out a way to take things back. And they're going to be helped greatly here by a couple things. Number one, thanks to the Reagan and Bush tax policies, the massive debt, and again, we have no war to build toward, no Cold War to build our military. Our military is now in decline thanks to the Cold War ending. We have a massive debt. We've had to raise taxes, and we're actually in the longest recession since the Depression at this point. So all during the Bush years, we're in a recession. By 1991, some 25 million workers, about 20% of the labor force, were unemployed at some point. Now, again, this is not 20% unemployment, because this was, kind of ebbed and flowed and waved through. So you weren't unemployed at all times, only at certain times. But that's a massive number. 25 million Americans at unemployment at some point. And of course, a bad economy gives an edge, gives a window for Democrats to make their move. And so in the 1992 election, Democrats were ready to come out of the wilderness. And they have formulated a plan. They have a cohesive vision once again. Unfortunately for, the old school Democrats, this was a very radically different message than they had employed from 1932 all the way through 1984. This was a very new message, a very different message. And so let's discuss this. And again, this right here shows you just how far the Reagan Revolution have changed things. Because they get together and they form what's called the Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC. And they're going to embrace what historians will term neoliberalism. They call themselves the New Democrat, as you see on the screen. So this is the New Democrat, aka neoliberalism. And what they embrace is what they call a middle course between liberalism and conservatism. So they favor things like fiscal conservatism, lower taxes, smaller government, market solutions rather than government welfare programs, a rejection of Keynesian economics. So, sound familiar? These are all things that Republicans embrace, that those movement conservatives embrace. The one thing that still makes them quote-unquote liberal is that they believe in social liberalism. Theoretically, they are pro-gay rights, they are pro-abortion rights, or pro-choice, and they are pro-civil rights. So in other words, they are fiscal conservatives and social liberals. This is the quote-unquote New Democrat, aka neoliberalism. And again, this is kind of that mishmashy, wonky type of ideology. But again, they're trying to appeal to these new voters in America that seem to embrace conservatism and movement conservatives. And so they're arguing that the Democratic Party that existed prior to 1992 was too liberal, too eager to embrace big government. And therefore, they've alienated much of that kind of middle mushy of America. Again, that silent majority group that Nixon and Reagan courted. And again, this is very much a reflection of the Reagan Revolution. So what does this look like? Again, I love this chart. And it really explains how things have changed here. So you can see my cursor on your screen right now, I believe. So here's the center of things here up until 1980. So you have the center, and you have to the right, you have the Republicans. Of course, the further right you get, the more radical Republican you get. And to the left, you have the blue, which is the Democratic Party, which the further left you get to the point where you're socialist or communist. And then you have the center, which is, the center of thing. And so, up until 1968 with Nixon, almost every candidate fell somewhere over here, and Nixon fell somewhere over here. Let's just say, for instance, you have a person who's right here. Again, someone like a Dwight Eisenhower who fell left of center. The Reagan Revolution center doesn't change, but the entire political party system shifts drastically to the right. And so that same person, let's just say this was Eisenhower right here, up here in the old days. Look where he's at now. He's far to the right of center. So even if you're a Democrat who believes in those liberal values, that maybe you weren't extreme way out there, you're not the Bernie Sanders or you're not the AOCs of the world, but you're somewhere near center here, but you're still left-leaning, Democratic, liberal. But that same left-leaning Democratic liberal now is way to the right of center. In other words, they're more conservative. And that's why I had a professor at University of Houston who argued that Barack Obama, in many respects, on many issues, was actually to the right of Ronald Reagan, because Reagan shifted it so far to the right that things have just radically altered itself. And that every person that comes after this, Republican, Democratic alike, they fall somewhere way to the right of this white line center. And so if you're a Republican then, you used to be fairly close to center. Look how far you are now away from center. So if you're someone like a George W. Bush or H.W. Bush, you are way out here on the far right side of center. And it really shifts the entire political system of our country.